Lyra's crystalline skin gradually shifted from alarmed orange to a cautious lavender as she followed Marcus through the Academy's sprawling main concourse. The human moved with a fluid confidence that both fascinated and unsettled her. Each step he took seemed precisely calculated, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings in a way that reminded her of predatory species in nature documentaries. "The dormitory complex is through the East Quadrant," Marcus explained, his voice surprisingly gentle for his imposing frame. "They've arranged housing by environmental requirements, not species. I think we both landed in Standard Atmosphere Block 7. Lyra maintained a careful 3-meter distance. "You seem quite familiar with the layout already." "I arrived last week on an early transport. Spent the time exploring," he said with a casual shrug that rippled the muscles beneath his academy uniform. "Humans tend to get restless when idle." The information confirmed what Lyra had studied about their species: perpetual motion, endless curiosity, inability to remain still. Evolutionary traits of both predator and prey, her xenobiology texts had explained. Always watching, always moving. As they entered the residential quadrant, other students parted subtly before them, or more accurately, before Marcus. Lyra noted how various species reacted to his presence, some with obvious unease, others with clinical interest. A group of bird-like Avarians fluttered their feather crests in agitation, while 2 hulking Drymac security students watched with professional assessment. "They're afraid of you," Lyra observed, her empathic senses detecting the emotional undercurrents in the atrium. Marcus smiled ruefully. "It happens everywhere we go. Humanity joined the Galactic Union only 36 standard cycles ago. Most species still think of us as unpredictable newcomers." He glanced at her. "Including Celestins, I imagine." Lyra's skin briefly flashed embarrassed pink before she could control the reaction. "We are taught to approach all new experiences with open minds," she recited diplomatically. "But also caution," he finished for her, surprising her with his knowledge of Celestin educational principles. They reached the dormitory assignment terminal, a floating holographic interface customizable to each species' biological interaction methods. For Lyra, it projected itself at her crystal sensory height. For Marcus, it reshaped to accommodate human visual and manual inputs. "Looks like we're neighbors rather than roommates," Marcus noted after they both registered. "You're in single-occupant chamber 422. I'm in 424. Lyra felt a wave of relief that she quickly suppressed, hoping her emotional projection hadn't been detectable. Different chambers is logical for species with disparate diurnal cycles. "And it probably helps with the whole terrifying human situation," Marcus added with unexpected humor. "Don't worry, most species feel more comfortable around us after a few weeks of exposure." The residential lift arrived, its doors sliding open to reveal a delicate, gelatinous Marodi student who immediately compressed their translucent body against the far wall at the side of Marcus. The human pretended not to notice as he gestured for Lyra to enter first. As the lift descended, Lyra found herself studying Marcus's reflection in the polished wall. His danger signals were undeniable. The dense musculature, the efficient movement, even the blunt teeth visible when he spoke. Yet he'd saved her life within moments of their first meeting, with no conceivable benefit to himself. Perhaps, Lyra thought, as the lift announced their floor, the Academy curriculum would provide insight into this fundamental contradiction. After all, understanding the universe's diverse lifeforms was precisely why she had traveled so far from her crystalline homeworld. She would approach this human paradox as she did all scientific mysteries, with careful observation, controlled experiments, and an open mind, despite the ancestral warnings echoing in her consciousness. The carnivorous plant's acid burn left a faint discoloration on Marcus's forearm, visible even 3 days later as they continued their xenobiology assignment. Lyra found her gaze returning to the mark repeatedly during their laboratory sessions. "Does it still cause discomfort?" she finally asked, her crystalline fingers delicately adjusting the nutrient flow to their plant specimens. Marcus glanced at his arm as though he'd forgotten about the injury. Barely notice it now. Human skin regenerates pretty quickly. Our professor mentioned that humans evolved remarkable healing capabilities, Lyra said. A necessity for a species from a high-gravity world with significant environmental hazards. Earth isn't so bad, Marcus replied with a hint of defensiveness. It's home. Their conversation paused as Professor Zilmax floated through the laboratory, her gaseous form swirling with approval as she inspected their work. The nebulite professor lingered briefly, her vapor tendrils examining the precise arrangement of Lyra's crystal structures. Excellent symbiotic adaptation, students, Professor Zilnax's translator hummed. The Celestin precision combined with human intuitive adjustments has yielded optimal growth patterns. After the professor moved on, Lyra considered this assessment. She's correct, she admitted. Your suggestions for modifying the nutrient ratios weren't in the protocol, yet they've accelerated development by 23%. Marcus shrugged. Just seemed right. Humans are pretty good at improvising. A trait both admirable and concerning, Lyra observed, then immediately worried her comment might offend. To her surprise, Marcus laughed. That's the most accurate description of humanity I've heard at the Academy. His eyes crinkled at the corners, a facial expression Lyra had learned indicated genuine amusement rather than aggression. Most species either think we're brilliant or terrifying. Few recognize we're both. Their discussion was interrupted by a commotion at the laboratory entrance. A delegation of senior officials swept in, led by Chancellor Vox, the Academy's imposing Dragorian administrator. Behind them walked a tall, elegantly dressed human female, whose presence caused Marcus to straighten immediately. Ambassador Chen, he murmured with evident respect. Lyra's crystalline form flickered with surprise. You share a name designation. My mother, Marcus confirmed quietly as the delegation toured the facility. Earth's representative to the Galactic Council. The ambassador's gaze found her son across the laboratory. With barely perceptible movements, they exchanged what Lyra recognized as a formal human greeting, a slight nod that somehow conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. After the delegation departed, Lyra noticed a shift in the laboratory atmosphere. Other students glanced toward Marcus with new interest, whispering among themselves. You didn't mention your familial connection to Earth's diplomatic corps, Lyra said as they cleaned their workstation. Marcus concentrated on properly storing the volatile compounds. It's not relevant to our studies. Yet it contextualizes your presence here, Lyra pointed out. Many assumed humans gained academy placements through physical aptitude alone. Some did, Marcus replied. Others through scientific achievements or artistic contributions. We're as diverse as any species. He paused, then added more quietly. That's why generalizations about humans being ferocious or dangerous miss the complexity. Lyra considered his words as they exited the laboratory. The evening illumination had shifted to accommodate nocturnal species, bathing the academy corridors in soft blue light that reflected off her crystalline form. Perhaps, she ventured carefully, my species has also been subject to oversimplification. We are viewed as uniformly peaceful, analytical, and detached. She hesitated before adding, not all Celestins fit this parameter. For the first time since their meeting, Marcus looked at her with genuine curiosity rather than careful politeness. Including you. Lyra's form shifted to a contemplative violet, a color rarely displayed to non-Celestins. I am beginning to question many predetermined conclusions, she admitted. About humans, about the galaxy, about myself. The acknowledgement hung between them, a small but significant bridge across their evolutionary divide. The third checkpoint of the Midnight Challenge loomed ahead, a towering structure of magnetic disruption panels that shifted unpredictably, designed to test adaptability and quick thinking. Above them, the 3 moons of the Academy planet aligned in perfect formation, bathing the botanical gardens in silvery blue light that made Lyra's crystalline form shimmer. This section favors species with electromagnetic sensitivity, Lyra observed as they approached the structure. A Voltraxian student was already halfway up, their naturally conductive appendages finding safe pathways through the shifting magnetic fields. Marcus studied the tower thoughtfully. And puts humans at a disadvantage. We can't sense magnetic fields at all. Celestians have limited sensitivity, Lyra offered. I can detect major disruptions, but not with enough precision to navigate safely. They watched as an avian scree attempted the climb, only to be repelled by a sudden magnetic pulse that sent them fluttering backward. Academy medical drones hovered nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. The Midnight Challenge was designed to be difficult, but not dangerous, at least not severely so. We could collaborate, Marcus suggested unexpectedly. Your sensitivity could warn of major shifts, while my climbing ability could get us both through. Lyra's surface crystals flickered with surprise. That would be permitted. Collaboration rather than competition. The rules don't forbid it, Marcus replied with a hint of the human trait they called mischief in his expression. Besides, real scientific advancement rarely happens in isolation. Lyra considered his proposal. Working together would demonstrate interspecies cooperation, a core academy value, but it would also require physical proximity to a human. The idea both intrigued and unsettled her. We would need to maintain contact for you to benefit from my electromagnetic sensitivity, she said. Marcus nodded. I understand if that's too uncomfortable for you. His consideration of her boundaries surprised her. Since their first meeting, he had been careful to respect her cultural norms regarding physical space, unlike some other species who found Celestin boundaries excessive. Before she could respond, the tower's magnetic fields shifted again, and the Voltraxian reached the summit with a flash of bioluminescent triumph. They had already lost significant time deliberating. We should proceed, Lyra decided, extending her crystalline hand. For academic advancement. Marcus accepted her offer with a careful grip, his warm hand enveloping her smaller crystalline one. The contact sent an unexpected sensation through Lyra's receptors, not unpleasant, but intensely different from touching other crystalline beings. They approached the tower together. As they began to climb, Lyra focused her sensory crystals on detecting the magnetic patterns, directing Marcus with subtle pressure changes in her hand. When a major disruption approached, her entire form would pulse with warning light. Marcus climbed with surprising grace for his species, finding handholds where none seemed to exist. His movements were efficient and precise, belying the common perception of humans as clumsy brutes. When the magnetic fields intensified unexpectedly, he adjusted their position with quick reflexes that prevented Lyra from being dislodged. Halfway up the tower, disaster struck nearby. A gelatinous Marodi student miscalculated a leak between panels and began sliding down the structure, their adhesive properties failing against the tower's slick surface. Without hesitation, Marcus secured his position with one hand and extended his other arm, catching the Marodi's descent at significant strain to his muscles. The sudden weight threatened to dislodge them all. Can you stabilize our position? Marcus asked through gritted teeth, his arm trembling with the effort of holding the frightened Marodi. Lyra extended her crystalline structures, creating anchor points that refracted light into the tower's sensors. The temporary override bought them precious seconds for the Marodi to regain their adhesion. The incident cost them valuable time, but as they finally reached the checkpoint, Lyra realized something had fundamentally shifted in her perception, not just of Marcus, but of what strength truly meant in the cosmos. The acidic mist thickened around Lyra, each droplet that touched her crystalline form sending spiderwebs of fractures across her surface. She had collapsed near her workstation, the emergency breathing apparatus just meters away but impossibly distant as her motor functions failed. Through the caustic haze, Lyra watched as Marcus wrapped the emergency barrier cloth around himself. The thin material offered minimal protection against the volcanic compounds now saturating the laboratory atmosphere. Even for human physiology, exposure beyond 30 seconds would cause permanent damage. "Get back," shouted the laboratory's automated system. Containment protocols in effect. Emergency response units dispatched. Marcus ignored the warnings, moving with deliberate efficiency through the thickening chemical cloud. His breathing was already labored, but his movements remained precise. Lyra tried to signal him to retreat, the logical course of action, but her communication crystals had already begun to deteriorate. He reached her in 12 seconds, kneeling beside her dissolving form. Without hesitation, he removed the barrier cloth from himself and carefully wrapped it around her, prioritizing the protection of her most vulnerable crystal matrices. "Stay with me," Marcus said, his voice rough from chemical exposure. "Focus on stabilizing your core structures." The selfish part of Lyra wanted to refuse his help, to spare him further injury, but her survival instincts overrode this impulse. She concentrated on pulling her consciousness into her protected central crystal chamber, a defensive technique Celestins evolved for extreme environmental threats. Marcus lifted her with extraordinary care, cradling her wrapped form against his chest to minimize impact vibrations. Each step he took through the contaminated laboratory clearly caused him pain as the chemicals attacked his exposed skin and respiratory system. The laboratory's emergency decontamination chamber loomed ahead, its sealed door indicating automated lockdown. Marcus approached the manual override panel and hesitated. Activating it would require removing one hand from supporting Lyra, risking potentially catastrophic fracturing in her weakened state. Making a swift decision, he turned his back to the panel, shielding Lyra with his body, while using his elbow to activate the emergency protocol. The panel beeped in acknowledgement, but the door remained sealed. "Secondary authentication required," announced the system. "Biometric confirmation needed." Marcus shifted Lyra carefully to access his academy identification. The movement sent shards of pain through her crystal network, but she maintained her core stabilization. The seconds stretched as the scanner processed his credentials, each moment allowing more chemical damage to accumulate. The door finally slid open, revealing the sterile environment of the decontamination chamber. Marcus staggered inside, and the door sealed behind them. Decontamination mist immediately engulfed them, neutralizing the corrosive compounds. Medical assistance required in decontamination chamber 3. Marcus managed to say before his legs gave way. He collapsed to his knees, but maintained his hold on Lyra, carefully lowering her to the chamber floor before his strength failed completely. As the emergency medical team accessed the chamber from the external entrance, Lyra's empathic senses, previously dulled by pain, suddenly sharpened. In the moment before unconsciousness claimed them both, she experienced something extraordinary. Direct emotional bleed-through from Marcus's consciousness. What she detected wasn't the savage triumph of a predator species or the clinical calculation of a strategic mind. Instead, she sensed profound relief intertwined with lingering fear, not for himself, but for her. The emotional resonance carried no ulterior motives, no expectation of reciprocity or advantage gained. For the first time in her existence, Lyra understood what humans called selflessness, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. The realization followed her into darkness as the medical team surrounded them both. The Academy's medical facility hummed with activity as specialized equipment monitored Lyra's recovering crystalline matrix. 3 days had passed since the laboratory incident, and her outer layers had begun to regenerate, spreading delicate lattices of new growth across damaged areas. The process was painful but necessary, a fundamental aspect of Celestin healing. Dr. Vennick approached her medical pod, his troll spots shifting color as he reviewed her latest readings. "Your core structures have maintained remarkable integrity," he observed. "Most crystalline beings would have experienced catastrophic fracturing under similar conditions." "I had assistance," Lyra replied softly, her communication crystals still tender from regeneration. "The human stabilized my primary matrices during transport." The doctor nodded. Marcus Chen exhibited exceptional knowledge of xenophysiology. His actions preserve your structural integrity at significant personal cost. He hesitated before adding, He specifically requested information about Celestin regeneration processes after his own treatment. This revelation surprised Lyra. For what purpose? He expressed concern about potential psychological trauma during your recovery. Dr. Venick explained. Apparently, humans experience something called recovery anxiety after physical trauma. He wondered if Celestins might face similar challenges. The concept struck Lyra as profoundly insightful. Celestins rarely discuss the emotional aspects of physical recovery, considering such matters private. That a human would intuitively recognize this dimension of her experience demonstrated unexpected perceptiveness. Later that afternoon, Marcus was permitted a brief visit. He entered the recovery chamber with careful steps, his movements more measured than usual. Dermal regeneration patches covered his arms where the chemicals had caused the most damage, and a slight roughness in his breathing indicated ongoing respiratory treatment. The lab has been completely decontaminated, he reported, settling into the visitor's chair beside her pod. Professor Zilnak salvaged most of our research data. Lyra studied him with newly calibrated perception. You recognized the specific threat to crystalline physiology immediately, she observed. Most non-Celestins lack such knowledge. Marcus smiled faintly. I may have done extra research after we became lab partners. Your species' physical structure is fascinating, as is your species' capacity for risk assessment, Lyra countered. You calculated that you could reach me in the decontamination chamber before sustaining irreversible damage. His expression shifted subtly. There wasn't much calculation involved, to be honest. I saw you in trouble and reacted. Lyra's regenerating crystals pulsed with confusion. That defies logical analysis. Self-preservation is a universal evolutionary imperative. Humans evolved as social creatures, Marcus explained, leaning forward despite obvious discomfort. Our survival often depended on collective action, sometimes prioritizing group welfare over individual safety. It's deeply ingrained in our psychology. Yet many species consider humans dangerously unpredictable, Lyra pointed out. The same instincts that drive us to save others can also make us formidable when threatened, Marcus acknowledged. Two sides of the same evolutionary coin. As they spoke, other academy students began arriving with recovery offerings, nutrient solutions from the Marodi, specialized light crystals from the Fauchelins, and atmospheric enhancers from the Nebulites. Each visitor regarded Marcus with newfound respect, several acknowledging his presence with their species' formal gestures of recognition. The Voltrexian student they had competed against in the Midnight Challenge approached Marcus directly, their electromagnetic appendages generating a pattern that translated as deep appreciation. Your actions honor all who seek knowledge, they said through their translator. Lyra observed these interactions with growing understanding. The laboratory incident had transformed perceptions throughout the academy, not just her own. What had begun as an individual rescue was catalyzing broader recognition of human complexity. Later, as the medical staff prepared her for another regeneration cycle, Lyra found herself contemplating the paradox Marcus represented. How the same evolutionary traits that made humans physically dangerous also enabled their profound capacity for compassion. The impromptu discussion group that had formed around Lyra and Marcus's study table had grown steadily over the past 2 weeks. What began as a simple xenobiology review session had evolved into a cross-species forum on evolutionary psychology. Today, representatives from 12 different species crowded the Academy Library's discussion dome, their diverse biological forms creating a living mosaic of galactic diversity. But surely predator species must always retain aggressive tendencies, argued a Mantillian student, their segmented exoskeleton clicking softly as they gestured. Evolutionary imperatives cannot simply be overwritten by cultural development. Marcus considered this thoughtfully. Not overwritten, perhaps, but redirected. Humans still possess predatory instincts. Our vision focuses forward. We track moving objects instinctively. We experience adrenaline responses to perceived threats. But we've channeled these traits into everything from competitive sports to emergency response systems. Lyra, her crystalline form now fully regenerated with subtle new patterns where the most severe damage had occurred, tapped the data display. Consider the statistical evidence. Human emergency responders routinely enter hazardous environments that logical risk assessment would categorize as unacceptable. Their injury rates exceed rational tolerance thresholds by 47%. Yet they continue this behavior. Added a floating nebulite student, their gaseous form pulsing with intellectual excitement. Our species would consider such actions fundamentally irrational. Perhaps rationality itself varies between evolutionary paths. Lyra suggested. What appears irrational from one perspective may represent a different form of logic, one that incorporates values beyond individual survival. The Mantillian's antennae flicked with surprise. This from a Celestin. Your species is renowned for prioritizing logical analysis above emotional response. Lyra's surface crystals shifted to a contemplative blue. Recent experiences have led me to reconsider certain assumptions. Her gaze briefly met Marcus's across the table. Emotional responses can contain their own logic, particularly when they emerge from evolutionary advantages. The discussion continued until the library's atmospheric cycles shifted for evening configuration. As the group dispersed, Professor Caldo, the Academy's venerable anthropology chair, approached their table. The ancient Cronivian's time-sensitive perceptions allowed him to observe developmental patterns invisible to most species. Fascinating discourse, he noted, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the library's ambient light. I've observed similar discussions emerging throughout the Academy since the laboratory incident. He focused on Lyra and Marcus with heightened attention. Your partnership appears to be catalyzing significant perceptual shifts. After the professor departed, Marcus organized his notes with characteristic precision. He's right, you know. Things are changing around here. Statistical evidence supports his observation, Lyra agreed. Interspecies collaborative projects have increased 22% this semester. Human students report a 34% decrease in avoidance behaviors from other species. Marcus smiled. Always the data analyst. It is my nature, Lyra replied, then added with unexpected warmth. Though I find myself increasingly valuing qualitative experiences alongside quantitative measurements. As they exited the library, a notification illuminated their communication devices simultaneously. The Academy director had approved their joint research proposal, a comprehensive study of interspecies cooperation during crisis response. The project would combine Lyra's analytical methodology with Marcus's practical experience in emergency situations. This represents a significant academic opportunity, Lyra observed as they crossed the evening-lit campus. Marcus nodded, but his expression suggested he valued something beyond the academic recognition. It's more than that. It's a chance to bridge understanding, to show that different evolutionary paths can complement rather than threaten each other. Lyra considered his words as the Academy's triple moons rose above the horizon, their combined light creating interference patterns through her crystalline form. Perhaps this was the most profound lesson she had learned since arriving at the Academy, that diversity represented not a challenge to overcome, but potential to be realized. The tension in the presentation hall crystallized as the young Dravari noble stepped closer to Lyra, his chitinous mandibles clicking with interest. His translator device converted his complex pheromonal speech into standard galactic common, but something in the translation seemed inadequate, a subtle undertone of possessiveness that the technology failed to fully convey. The Vexia clan has not encountered crystalline sentience with such advanced empathic capabilities, the noble stated. Your structural composition would provide valuable insight for our biological archives. Marcus maintained his position between them, his posture deliberate, neither aggressive nor submissive. Academy security personnel remained frozen in indecision at the perimeter, their training on diplomatic protocols conflicting with their protective mandate. Perhaps, Marcus suggested with measured calm, the esteemed Vexia clan would appreciate receiving research data instead. Celestine crystallography has been extensively documented in academic publications that would honor your archives. The Draveri's compound eyes shifted rapidly, assessing Marcus with newfound attention. The insectoid noble's attendants tensed, their specialized limbs adjusting slightly, a subtle combat readiness that most species would miss, but that Marcus had clearly noticed. Lyra stepped forward to stand beside Marcus rather than behind him, a deliberate choice that registered immediately with the Draveri. In their hierarchical society, positioning conveyed status relationships. "The human speaks with my full authority," Lyra stated, her crystalline form pulsing with formal diplomatic patterns. "I would be honored to discuss scientific exchange of information rather than physical specimens." The Draveri noble's antennae twitched in what his cultural attaché later described as surprise. Among the Draveri, unified presentation across species lines was rare. Their evolutionary history had ingrained deep mistrust of genetic outsiders. "You stand together," the noble observed. "Hunter and crystalline, predator and prey. This contradicts established biological imperatives." "With respect," Marcus replied, "many of the galaxy's established imperatives benefit from periodic reassessment. The Academy itself exists to discover unexpected connections. The human demonstrates wisdom," the noble declared after a moment of consideration, his mandibles relaxing from their threat position. The Vexia recognize wisdom regardless of its biological origin. The diplomatic staff visibly relaxed as the noble made a formal gesture of scientific interest rather than acquisition. "We withdraw our request for physical specimens and propose instead a data exchange protocol." As negotiations proceeded toward a formal research agreement, Chancellor Vox approached Marcus and Lyra with measured approval. That, the Dragorian administrator rumbled quietly, was exceptionally well handled. The Draveri rarely reconsider their initial positions. It was Marcus's approach, Lyra acknowledged. Direct confrontation would have triggered their dominance responses, while complete submission would have confirmed their right to collect specimens. "I just tried to offer an alternative that preserved everyone's dignity," Marcus said with characteristic understatement. The Chancellor's scales shifted in the Dragorian equivalent of a contemplative smile. "Perhaps this is why humans have integrated into galactic society with unexpected speed. You innately understand the space between confrontation and capitulation." Later, as they prepared for the Galactic Conference's closing ceremonies, Lyra reviewed the finalized research exchange agreement with satisfaction. What could have become a diplomatic disaster had instead opened new channels of scientific cooperation. The Draveri delegate referred to you as a protector species in their formal documentation, she noted to Marcus as they walked toward the grand ceremonial hall. "This classification doesn't exist in standard xenobiological taxonomy." Marcus considered this. Maybe it should. There are species throughout the galaxy that evolved to safeguard others. Symbionts that defend their hosts, herd guardians, even specialized castes in collective societies. But humans didn't evolve specifically to protect other species, Lyra pointed out. "No," Marcus agreed. "But perhaps protection itself transcends evolutionary categories. Maybe it's a pattern that emerges across different paths when sentience reaches a certain threshold." The graduation ceremony transformed the Academy's grand amphitheater into a living tableau of galactic diversity. Representatives from over 200 worlds occupied the tiered seating, their varied physiologies accommodated by adaptive environmental fields. In the diplomatic section, Ambassador Chen sat beside the Celestine Evolutionary Council, their formal differences set aside in recognition of the occasion. Lyra's crystal structure gleamed with ceremonial enhancements as she concluded her address, the patterns of her light refraction conveying emotional nuances that transcended verbal language. The protection paradox reflects a universal truth that crosses evolutionary boundaries, she stated, her voice resonating through precisely calibrated acoustic enhancers. "Whether we evolved as predators or prey, as individuals or collectives, as crystalline or carbon-based life forms, we all seek security while pursuing growth. The apparent contradiction between these imperatives represents not a flaw in our design, but the fundamental engine of advancement. From his position among the graduating class, Marcus watched with quiet pride. The Lyra, who had once maintained a 3-meter safety distance from humans, now stood confidently before the assembled galaxy, challenging conventional biological determinism with elegant logic and personal testimony. The Academy was founded on the principle that knowledge transcends evolutionary origins. Lyra continued, "Yet we have often approached this ideal through the lens of taxonomic categorization, defining species by their differences rather than their connections. Our research suggests an alternative approach, understanding species through their complementary capacities rather than their contradictions." The Draveri delegation chittered with approval, their formal recognition patterns illuminating their section of the amphitheater. In the months since the diplomatic incident, they had become unexpected advocates for integrated research methodologies. As Lyra concluded her address, Chancellor Vox approached the ceremonial platform, his ancient Dragorian form moving with deliberate dignity. "It is my privilege to announce that the Galactic Council has approved funding for the establishment of the Integrated Protection Sciences Division, a new research initiative that will explore cross-species cooperation during crisis response." The announcement triggered a wave of bioluminescent reactions throughout the amphitheater as various species expressed approval through their natural light-generating capabilities. The display created cascading patterns of blue, green, and gold light that rippled across the gathered assembly. The graduation ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of knowledge crystals, each graduate receiving a crystalline matrix containing the accumulated wisdom of their academic journey. As Marcus accepted his crystal, he found a secondary matrix attached, a Celestin honor token rarely bestowed on non-crystalline species. Later, at the reception overlooking the Academy's botanical gardens, Lyra found Marcus standing beside the reflective pool that housed the ancient Aquarian meditation spheres. "The research division appointment is a significant honor," she said, joining him by the pool's edge. "Director of Emergency Response Protocol suits your capabilities, as does your appointment to lead the Theoretical Framework Department," Marcus replied, "though I suspect we'll be collaborating frequently." Lyra's surface crystals shifted to a warm amber hue, the color of comfortable certainty in Celestin emotional spectrum. "Our complementary approaches proved effective in academic settings. I see no reason they wouldn't continue to yield optimal results in professional contexts." Marcus smiled at her characteristically analytical assessment. "In human terms, we make a good team." Around them, new Academy students observed their interaction with curious interest, particularly a young Celestin whose crystalline form displayed the distinctive patterns of the northern continental clusters. Like Lyra years earlier, her posture suggested caution when a human student approached her discussion group. But unlike Lyra's first days, this new Celestin student didn't step back. Perhaps she had heard the stories that now circulated throughout the Academy. Stories of a crystalline alien who discovered that the supposedly ferocious humans contained depths of gentleness that defied conventional evolutionary categorization.